It happened quietly at first. No headlines, no leaks. Just a sealed order from a federal judge known more for backroom loyalty than constitutional integrity. Kash Patel, former federal prosecutor, national security advisor, and outspoken advocate for government transparency, was suddenly arrested under the vague charge of willful obstruction of a classified investigation. No press conference, no Miranda rights on camera. Just a black SUV, 3 federal agents, and a silent ride to a holding facility on the edge of D.C. When news finally broke, 17 hours later, it sent shockwaves through political circles. Not because Kash Patel had been arrested, but because no one knew why. No warrant was unsealed, no evidence presented, no indictment published. Just an order signed by Judge Malcolm Rourke, a Clinton-era appointee with a long record of siding with federal agencies over whistleblowers. The headlines rolled in fast. Kash Patel arrested, silence from DOJ. What's going on? No charges, no explanation, no bail. Free speech or federal threat. But while cable networks bickered and speculated, one man moved quietly but decisively. Senator JD Vance. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't rage tweet. Instead, he flew to D.C., walked into his Senate office and requested a private intelligence briefing on the judge who signed the order. 3 hours later, he walked out, holding a single red folder. Inside that folder, enough to shake the federal courthouse to its foundation, because J.D. Vance didn't just suspect Judge Rourke was corrupt, he could prove it. Back in his office, J.D. Vance sat alone with the red folder. No cameras, no aides, just documents, dense, stamped, and dangerous. He flipped through pages with a slow, deliberate pace, his jaw tightening with every line he read. Inside were classified briefings, financial disclosures, and internal DOJ memos, all tying Judge Malcolm Rourke to a network of bureaucratic insiders who had been quietly coordinating preemptive detentions of high-risk whistleblowers. Not criminals, not terrorists, truth-tellers. And Kash Patel? He was target number 3 on a list marked Asset Containment Media Risk Class. J.D. Vance knew exactly what this was, a system that didn't care about guilt, only silence. And Judge Rourke was a central cog in the machine. He made one phone call, not to a reporter, not to a political ally, but to the Senate Oversight Subcommittee. I need a special session. Urgent review. I'll present the documents myself. The chair hesitated. Is this about Patel? J.D. didn't blink. It's about a judge who forgot he serves the people, not the agencies protecting themselves. That night, while America argued online and pundits speculated, J.D. Vance sat in a closed hearing room, walking 6 senators through the evidence. He held up memos. He read emails aloud. He showed wire transfers. He showed connections between Rourke's offshore accounts and federal contractors who had lost lawsuits thanks to Patel's investigations. By the end, the room was silent. One senator whispered, "This isn't just judicial misconduct, this is conspiracy." J.D. stood. "Then let's make it public." The next morning, J.D. Vance walked into a press room on Capitol Hill. Still no anger in his voice, still no theatrics. He simply said, "Kash Patel has been jailed without a real charge, and I now have proof that the judge who signed the order has committed crimes far more serious than anything Kash's enemies have accused him of. This is not a partisan issue. This is about power being used to crush truth." And with that, he held up the red folder. Live, on camera. The clip went live at 9:03 a.m. By 9:07, it had already hit every platform. Twitter, X, TikTok, YouTube, Telegram. Senator JD Vance holding up a red folder and saying, "This judge jailed the wrong man, and I can prove it." News anchors scrambled to interrupt their scheduled programming. Pundits froze mid-commentary as producers yelled into earpieces, "Get the Vance footage on screen, now." In the 7-minute press conference, Vance laid out exactly what Judge Rourke had hoped would never see daylight. A sealed memo from DOJ insiders describing Kash Patel as a containment priority due to his exposure of Pfizer abuse. A secret communication from Rourke to a deputy clerk asking for expedited custody authorization without due process. Financial documents showing Rourke had received consulting payments from a defense contractor Patel had helped audit 3 years prior. Vance never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The facts did the shouting for him. By 9:30 a.m., hashtags were trending worldwide. Free Kash, Rourke resign, Vance vindicates. And the most viral one, jailed for truth. Even normally hostile media outlets couldn't spin it. One left-leaning anchor said live on air, Whatever you think of JD Vance politically, this is one of the most explosive allegations of judicial corruption we've seen in decades. Meanwhile, inside the DC Federal Detention Center, where Kash Patel sat in a cold cell, a guard quietly passed him a tablet. No words. Just the headline, JD Vance accuses federal judge of conspiracy, DOJ forced to respond. Kash read it, slowly, then smiled. In Judge Rourke's chambers, the mood was very different. His staff was silent, his phone was off the hook, and his private line had one voicemail blinking red. Call from Inspector General's office. Urgent. He sat down at his desk, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in years, he wasn't feared. He was being investigated. And JD Vance had just painted a target on his judicial robe, with precision. The next morning, the courtroom was standing room only. Federal guards stood shoulder to shoulder at every exit. Cameras were barred from entry, but journalists were packed like sardines, fingers twitching over keyboards, waiting for something they could barely believe was real. Kash Patel was being brought before the same judge who jailed him, and JD Vance was there, walking into the gallery with the red folder under his arm. Judge Malcolm Rourke entered from his chambers slower than usual. The gavel hit wood, but this time it sounded hollow. He cleared his throat. This court will hear arguments regarding the defendant's continued detainment. Kash's legal team stood first. They barely needed to speak. The room already knew what the world knew. There were no charges, no criminal case, no evidence, just a judge who had acted alone, behind closed doors, under the banner of national security, and now stood publicly accused of corruption. Then, to the shock of everyone in the room, Senator JD Vance stood up. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I've filed an amicus brief and request 5 minutes to speak on behalf of public interest. Rourke looked like he'd swallowed glass. Denied, he said sharply. You are not counsel. You are not. The courtroom door burst open. A U.S. Marshal entered and walked briskly to the bench, handed the judge a white envelope and whispered something no one could hear. Judge Rourke's face paled. He read the document, hands trembling slightly. And then, in front of a room full of witnesses, he sighed and said, This court acknowledges the newly opened federal inquiry and therefore grants immediate release of Mr. Patel under a writ of habeas corpus. He is free to go. The room erupted. Kash stood slowly, eyes locked with JD across the room. A nod. No words. No grand gesture. Just mutual respect between two men who refused to bow. But it wasn't over. JD Vance stepped forward, held up the red folder, and said loud enough for the gallery to hear, This is going to the Ethics Committee next. Justice isn't revenge, but it also isn't silence. Judge Rourke didn't bang the gavel. He didn't even speak. Because at that moment, for the first time in his career, he had no authority left. The double doors of the courthouse swung open. Kash Patel stepped into daylight, free for the first time in days. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't flanked by security. He walked alone. But the moment he appeared, the crowd waiting outside erupted into applause so loud it drowned out every reporter's question. Signs waved overhead, jailed for telling the truth. Kash stood. JD fought. The Constitution just won. JD Vance followed behind, flanked by no security, holding no press statement. He simply walked up beside Kash. A handshake, then a pat on the shoulder. Nothing rehearsed. Just respect between warriors who had stood back to back. As they stepped up to the microphones, the press surged. Questions flew like shrapnel. Senator Vance, is Judge Rourke going to be removed? Mr. Patel, will you press charges? Is this the beginning of a wider investigation? Kash held up a hand. You don't jail a man because he asked questions. You don't silence Americans with a robe and a title. And if you try, well, let today be a warning. Then JD stepped forward, calm as ever. We've forgotten something in this country. The judges don't rule us. They serve the law, just like the rest of us. Judge Rourke thought silence was safer than truth. He was wrong, and he will answer for it. The clip aired on every network that evening, but it didn't just air. It detonated. Free Kash trended again, this time alongside a new tag, Rourke resigns. The Ethics Committee confirmed it was launching a full review. Anonymous sources leaked that 5 more judges who had used similar sealed orders were now under scrutiny. Kash Patel was invited to testify before the Senate Oversight Committee. JD Vance was asked to co-chair a bipartisan working group on judicial transparency. But neither man was focused on politics. They were focused on finishing the job. Because now the people weren't just watching, they were demanding answers. Days after Kash Patel walked free, the Senate convened an emergency hearing on judicial overreach and the abuse of sealed orders. JD Vance, now co-chair of the panel, arrived carrying the same red folder, worn at the edges, now a symbol across America. The chamber was packed, journalists leaned in, former judges watched from the balcony, and millions tuned in from home. JD didn't open with law, he opened with truth. I'm not here to talk about politics, I'm here to talk about trust. We give judges power to protect the Constitution, not to hide from it. He flipped open the folder, calmly laying out what had been exposed. Secret detentions of whistleblowers under false pretenses, judicial orders issued without probable cause, a coordinated system that punished transparency and rewarded silence. These weren't mistakes, these were decisions. And every time a gavel fell in darkness, the people lost a little more faith in justice. He turned to the gallery. Kash Patel didn't break the law. He broke a pattern, and for that a judge tried to bury him in silence. But silence is not safety. Silence is rot, and today this chamber has a choice, to clean the bench or let the rot spread. The silence afterward was heavy, real, uncomfortable, but it wasn't anger JD stirred, it was reflection, because for once no one could spin it. The next morning the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial titled, "The Vance Doctrine, When Truth Shames Power." C-SPAN replayed the speech on loop. Social media turned it into clips, memes, t-shirts, and across the country, public defenders, veterans, teachers and students began quoting JD's closing line, "When the gavel becomes a weapon, we need someone to knock it out of the hand that wields it." It didn't come with a bang. There were no FBI raids or camera crews. It came quietly, with a single sheet of paper slipped into the public record. Judge Malcolm Rourke has submitted his resignation, effective immediately, citing health concerns. But everyone knew the truth. He resigned because he was cornered, and because JD Vance and Kash Patel never blinked. What followed was a wave of pressure across the judiciary. 3 other judges connected to sealed detentions stepped down in the following weeks. A bipartisan bill titled the Judicial Transparency Act began gaining momentum in the Senate. The DOJ quietly settled with 2 former whistleblowers who had been illegally gagged, both of whom cited JD Vance and Kash Patel's case as the reason they came forward again. But the moment that struck deepest wasn't on Capitol Hill. It happened at a small town hall in Dayton, Ohio. JD Vance was asked by a veteran during a Q&A, "How do you know it's worth it? Pushing back against a system that powerful?" JD looked out at the modest crowd and answered, "Because when one man sits in a cell for telling the truth and the judge who put him there walks free, then silence wins. And we can't let that happen. Not on our watch." Kash Patel, sitting in the front row, stood up quietly. "That's why I got out of the cell, because you didn't let them shut the door on truth. And I won't let them shut it on the next guy either." The room stood up. Every person. No music, no cameras. Just the sound of people realizing they still had a voice, and that voice mattered again. It started with small gatherings, veterans, teachers, truckers, tech workers, people from every background, holding candlelight meetings outside courthouses across the country. At first, they just read JD Vance's speech aloud. Then they started sharing their own stories. A whistleblower who lost her job. A teacher silenced for exposing corruption in school funding. A soldier reprimanded for speaking up about mental health failures in the VA. And every time they finished, they repeated the same phrase, "Silence is not safety." The media dubbed it the Speak Free movement. But it wasn't just talk. JD and Kash helped launch a nationwide legal fund to defend whistleblowers and citizens unfairly silenced by courts or bureaucracy. Within weeks, over 10,000 small donations flooded in. A volunteer network of over 800 lawyers pledged pro bono services. A series of new bills titled the Truth Defender Acts were introduced in state legislatures across 17 states. JD Vance gave a quiet interview to a college journalist who asked, "Did you plan for any of this?" He shook his head. "No, I just couldn't watch a man like Kash Patel get caged for telling the truth and do nothing." Kash added, "We didn't ask to start a movement. They forced one, and now they can't stop it." The logo went viral, a a broken gavel lying across an open constitution. People wore it as pins, tattoos, patches. Speak Free trended every week, and the ripple effect reached places no one expected. Journalists stopped using anonymous sources as weapons. Judges began live-streaming more proceedings. Even DOJ internal memos were being restructured for public transparency. What started as one red folder, power never gives up quietly. As the Speak Free movement spread, the establishment struck back. A leaked memo from inside the DOJ revealed plans for a new initiative labeled Information Integrity Enforcement. On paper, it sounded harmless, even noble, but in reality, it was a thinly veiled crackdown. A new task force aimed at monitoring unauthorized disclosures of government activity, including the kind of transparency Kash Patel had championed. Worse, a House subcommittee quietly introduced a rider to a spending bill, language that would allow judges to reseal cases deemed destabilizing to public confidence. It passed committee vote, 5-4. One step from the floor. The media barely covered it. But JD Vance noticed. And Kash, he saw the writing on the wall. They're not just trying to shut us up, they're trying to write silence into law. JD requested emergency time on the Senate floor. He stood alone in the chamber late into the night. C-SPAN barely covered it, but his words were picked up everywhere online. This is not about secrets, it's about shame. And when shame becomes policy, freedom becomes an illusion. If the truth scares you, then you were never worthy of the gavel in the first place. Clips went viral. Protests reignited, but this time peaceful and pointed. Letters poured into Congress. Church groups, veterans associations, civil rights organizations all lined up in opposition. And when the bill finally came to the House floor, it failed. By just 6 votes. 6. But it was enough. Enough to prove the movement couldn't be silenced. Not by laws, not by fear, and not by robes. That night, JD and Kash appeared on a small live stream with a retired judge from Nebraska. No soundstage, no script, just a message. Kash spoke directly to the camera. They thought this was about me, or about JD, but it was never about us. It's about whether you will speak next, or be told to stay quiet and clap while they write your silence into law. And JD added, the next folder won't be mine. It'll be yours. And the country will listen, because they know truth doesn't need permission. Was now a national firewall against silence. 1 year after Kash Patel walked free and the movement against silence swept the country, something quiet and historic happened. Not a rally, not a headline, not a breaking news banner, a dedication. Outside the US. Federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., where Judge Rourke once ruled from the bench, a crowd gathered under grey skies. Politicians came. Veterans came. Teachers, whistleblowers, factory workers all stood shoulder to shoulder, not because they were told to, but because they remembered. At the center stood a newly unveiled bronze plaque. Simple, powerful. It read, in honor of those who stood when silence was easier. When justice was delayed, they reminded us that truth does not expire. Dedicated to Kash Patel and Senator JD Vance for reminding a republic who it belongs to. JD stood off to the side, hands in his coat pockets. No speech, no cameras in his face, just reflection. Kash approached the mic, looked out at the crowd and said, I don't want a monument. I wanted a moment where the country woke up and said, this will never happen again. He paused. This plaque is not for me. It's for the kid out there who's told to shut up. It's for the soldier who sees too much and is told to forget it. It's for the next man they try to jail, and the next senator who says, no, not on my watch. That clip, just 58 seconds, would go on to be replayed in civics classes for the next generation. Later, as the ceremony ended, a child, maybe 11 years old, walked up to JD Vance. He held a notebook in one hand, a pen in the other. Mr. Vance, can I ask you something? JD kneeled. Sure. How do you know when to stand up? JD smiled. When everyone else is sitting, and something inside you says, this isn't right, that's when. The boy nodded, then walked over to the plaque and read it again. The Republic had listened, and it would not forget.